July
1937, I believe it was.
And what was the purpose of your coming here?
She invited me out. I'd met her socially in Rye, New York, and I'd heard of Woodstock, of course. She just invited me out on a social visit to show me the mountains.
And what made you decide that you wanted to build a church here?
Well, I didn't think of building a church at first. I thought of locating here and perhaps having a place to come to for a few months in the summer. But according to my mental makeup and things, it's incredible that I should live without a church. And so I was hardly here 2 or 3 days before I started to lay the foundations and build the church.
Did Mrs. Whitehead give you this property?
Yes.
The entire property. In all that time, Father Francis, the first time you came to Woodstock was when and for what reason?
I came out here at the invitation of Mrs. Ralph Radcliffe Whitehead, whose husband was the founder of the art colony here in July 1937, I believe it was.
And what was the purpose of your coming here?
She invited me out. I'd met her socially in Rye, New York, and I'd heard of Woodstock, of course. She just invited me out on a social visit to show me the mountains.
And what made you decide that you wanted to build a church here?
Well, I didn't think of building a church at first. I thought of locating here and perhaps having a place to come to for a few months in the summer. But according to my mental makeup and things, it's incredible that I should live without a church. And so I was hardly here 2 or 3 days before I started to lay the foundations and build the church.
Did Mrs. Whitehead give you this property?
Yes.
The entire property. In all that time that you've been here, within, wouldn't you say 1929?
1937.
1937, I beg your pardon. What changes have you noted in Woodstock?
Changes like the rest of the world. Woodstock has become up to date. It's gone from a quiet, dreamy little village in the old times, which was peopled mostly by the old settlers of Dutch background and the famous Woodstock artist colony of yesteryear.
What do you mean by yesteryear?
There were different people, they're all mature, they're people of advanced age. I used to irreverently refer to them in those days as a lot of old people. I was 52. And
Who are some of these people?
well, the ones I think the most above all, Frank London and his wonderful wife, Bradley Tomlins, Spiker, Kuniyoshi, Alice Wardwell, who was the saint, who bought pictures when she didn't need them just to keep people from starving. Other people they used to do weaving. It was a heterogeneous crowd. And then across in what we now call the Maverick was Hervey White, who was perhaps the great saint. Hervey looked, I think he was the original hippie, really. He was half man, half goat and half god. He looked like Pam, but a more lovable, sincere man never lived.
Tell us more about Hervey White. Did you ever meet with him?
Oh, I knew Hervey very well. Hervey came from Chicago. I came from Chicago too. And we both had a past, not a past we were ashamed of, but it was a past that meant very much towards our future, you see. It was with the literati and the art people. Hervey bought a tract across the river, which he called the Maverick, for a mere song. And he proceeded to make a fortune by giving most of the land away to people that were very deserving, many of them have turned out to be really great people. Hervey was a dreamer, very kindly, a man that didn't wear his morals on his coat sleeve. He was not immoral or immoral. He was just a genuinely good man that you couldn't help but love. He didn't fit in with Mr. Whitehead's scheme. Mr. Whitehead was a disciplinarian. He was an Englishman. In that he didn't understand artists, because you can't put artists under a discipline. So Irving took the mavericks into his bosom and let them buy land for nothing across there. He erected a theatre out of slab sides and old trees, and it became really quite famous. Many great stars of yesteryear played there. And then he had, in a quarry, he made a place where they could give concerts. They still do. If there was one person in the Woodstock colony there that outshone all the others, in my way of thinking, it was Hervey White. The last time I saw Hervey was at a funeral. We were burying Mrs. Dalton. She was a writer of children's books. Mrs. Dalton was a more active talker than they say I am. And I know on the way home from the funeral, Hervey White looked at me and says, well, this was the one time when Aggie, we called Mrs. Dalton Aggie, when Aggie didn't have everything to say. Then Hervey turned to me at that time. He said, Father, when it happens to me, it happens to all of us, I want you to take over. I want you to say the things that you said over Aggie, the things about the mountains. He says, they were delightfully pagan. Will you? I said, if you put it in writing, I will, but it must be put into writing.
Do you remember some of those things you said?
Yes, there were some of the Psalms of David about the mountains, which are very applicable, which I use now. I used them just 2 weeks ago at the funeral of Ernie Bach, who was very humble but very lovable character here. It was about the strength of the mountains and living on the mountains. I know now just what he meant by it. I've lived here for 33 years.
What do the mountains mean to you?
Strength, fearlessness, a living poetry, something that's higher than yourself. You can call it God, you can call it what you want, but it's the experience, it's God's footstool. I often tell young people, do you read the Bible? Read it for good poetry. If it's in a good translation, the King James Version won't hurt you, because everything that happened there was a note, happened on a mountain. I said in the providence of God, I came on a mountain, and in a little way it's happening to me. There's an aloofness from the trivialities and the pettiness of people that congest valleys and down below.
Earlier I mentioned to you that in many of the interviews we've had, many of the artists and craftsmen and so forth talked about a spiritual value in Woodstock, and they haven't been able to define it. Do you think you could?
No, not yet, but if you'll give me 5 more years, I probably will arrive at a definite conclusion, because it's been coming in the altogether too obvious. The old people had it, but they had it in a very respectable, according to Hoyle, way. If they started to talk about religion, everybody looked for the nearest exit, because they were convinced they were in the hands of some fanatics. Now you hear young people talking of things that are deeply religious, not denominational, but of the things that matter, the things that's going to see in every man his brother, whether he's black or white, Jew or Gentile, as much as his own mother's son. The things that does away with all the petty little things that have kept us apart for so long. I've been aware of this as time's gone on.
Well, let's continue with the changes in Woodstock. All right, we went through the Hervey White era. What happened then after Hervey?
Hervey passed on the next day to the day he was a pallbearer at the funeral. Changes came little by little. Woodstock was more or less of a verbally armed camp between the old-timers of Dutch settlement and the artists. This went on with sort of an armed neutrality till on Thanksgiving Day, the clergy, and there were few in number in those days, we had a union service in the Methodist Church. And I, being a newcomer, a big city guy they used to call me, they asked me to speak, and I said no, I was an old trooper. I had with me a young priest, Father Victor, who was only 24, who had the mind of modern youth. Let him preach a Thanksgiving Day service and say what he's thankful for. Father Victor came to me after I told him he'd been assigned this job, and he said, Father, you'd better take it over because it's a big proposition. I said, no, Vicky, you have to do it. Well, give me a text. And with malice towards some, I quoted something from the Old Testament, which said something about your fathers have eaten sour grapes, and their teeth are set up an edge. Now I says, Victor, see what you can do with that. Oh, he said, it sounds so silly. Think it over and come and tell me. I didn't hear the rest till he preached the sermon. It was in the old Methodist church, which is now a movie house. All of the pious people were there, partly out of curiosity, partly because I suppose they're humble, they did thank God for something. But Father Victor injected extemporaneously a text about the other prophets. He said he thought that the prophets of the Old Testament were afflicted, many of them, with indigestion. They struck a sour note. But he said he thought it was the duty of the modern Woodstock people to consider those prophets of pen and brush who tried to make the face of God immortal. And the next morning at the post office, I met a number of the artists, and they said, "We discovered at last your young curate has recognized us." And that was really the beginning of my life among the artists in Woodstock.
What happened then?
We became more friendly, and as I started to build up here, the old-time artists would come up. They'd walk up. They were not young, any of them were all much older than I was. I was an old man at 52 then. They'd walk up the mountain, and they'd come here in the unfinished church, and I can hear Frank London, who was a southerner, a real southerner of the old school. He wouldn't offend, not needlessly, but I hear him say, "I wonder what he's done this week." And then there'd be a pause. I'd look at the carving I was done and I'd done. Then he'd say, "I wonder if he really knows what he's doing." And then I'd go and shake hands at the door, and I remember it was the same Mr. London says, speaking of Father Victor, Father Boniface and myself, "Do you boys eat?" I said, "Well, we don't drink. Give us a chance to show it." He says, "Well, could you come down and have dinner with us next Thursday night?" Accepted. And that was our first public appearance in Woodstock. Alice Wardwell, who was the Lady Bountiful of the community, she was a person you can't say anything too good about her philanthropy, her understanding. She was there, and of course several other people. And I told Father Victor, "Now I think we're going to like it here." And we did.
How long was this after you first come here?
It was late in the first summer, and it was towards the autumn of the first summer.
Now art was predominant at that time, and I guess crafts were.
It was the leading, yes, you had a few craftspeople that did silver work, metal work, wood carving, but it was mostly the graphic arts. It was when Spiker was probably one of the greatest artists in the world, Koenig and people like that.
Bellows was here too.
Bellows was here too. He was the leader of them all in his day. He passed away altogether too soon. But there was a fellowship among those people that was, I never found among other people. There was nothing petty about them. They'd have jokes, and there was a little gossip, but the gossip was delicious and not malicious.
And the famous Woodstock parties.
Yes. Where the congested area is now back of Dina's was a pine grove. It was very beautiful. Thick pine needles and the pine trees above them. All of that part were pine. It was a pine forest. And they used to have famous parties at night by candlelight and moonlight. And they would sing. It was very much like a glorified edition of Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience.
Did you, no, you weren't here for the Maverick Festival.
It was just declining when I came. There were a few. And it was not the fault of the Woodstock Maverick people. It was the outsiders that came from neighboring towns that ruined it. They took advantage of the artist's good nature.
Would you say there was any similarity between that festival and the one that took place at Bethel?
Yes, the one at Bethel was like you plant a seed and you get an overripe melon. The magnitude of the one at Bethel was beyond all belief.
What similarity was there between that and the Maverick feeling?
There was a freedom of expression, a unity of purpose. It lacked the small cattiness that you'll find among, say, politicians and other people. real artists are very generous. You may not agree, but you'll agree to disagree and be very good about it. I think the festival at Bethel was just the overflowering of what was started here by Burge Harrison and the people that ultimately resulted in the Art Students League coming here.
Then you wouldn't make the disclaimer, as many people in Woodstock do at this point, that that was 60 or 70 miles away and it has nothing to do with Woodstock.
No, it had something to do with Woodstock, because it was definitely it was a group from the other mountain here, the commune up there, and I met with a group of them myself at the time that came from the hog farm in Taos, New Mexico. I saw them when they went, and I saw them when they came back. I couldn't have gone because I had duties here, which I don't shirk. But my spirit was there.
Now, then came the 30s and a sort of a fallow period for Woodstock.
It was due to the Grim Reaper mostly. Unfortunately, many people you should learn to love fade out, they die. It's something ahead of all of us. They faced it magnanimously. And I, being the only archbishop or bishop, and as Victor Lasher said, that I would get the funerals because there was a note of hope in them. It was my unlucky lot to say the last words over most of them. But they were the unforgettable people of my life, the prophets of pen and brush.
Well, what new form did art take at that point in Woodstock?
What, beg pardon?
What new form did art take in Woodstock?
Well, we went from the old conventional art forms into modern art, but there was nothing catty about that. There was a little peculiar remarks, as artists are very humorous among themselves. There was nothing small.
And did new forms such as music and so forth and so on start?
Yes, they came in, but they didn't have such a marked impression as the graphic arts did. That definitely was Woodstock's chief thing.
And with the coming of, would you say that Bob Dylan was the opening door, perhaps, to a new generation in Woodstock?
He was the John the Baptist of the new era. The old-timers didn't even know who Bob Dylan was. And then they had a rude awakening to find out that he was known all over the world except among the old-timers of Woodstock. Then they all tried to get into the act.
And he visited with you quite often?
Oh, he used to come up here very often. But long before I knew who he was, he used to come up, and I didn't know till it was Mrs. Schultes in the Bearsville store that's Bob Dylan. We used to discuss the Middle West, where I knew Gallup, New Mexico, where he lived. I was brought up in the Middle West, although I'm not a Midwesterner. We found much in common, and he was very much interested in the fact that I like to build. I like woodwork. He didn't seem to think that he could do it. Of course he could do it. He never tried. Bob Dylan could do anything if he tried.
Did he seem like John the Baptist too?
In a way. He was meek and humble of heart. Yes, he was. I should say fundamentally Bob Dylan is a very religious but non-denominational person. In his conversation, he'd always try to find out if there was something connected with the higher forms of religion that I knew through long experience, and a title that he didn't know that he aspired to. I spent a memorable Thanksgiving Day with Bob Dylan. He invited me down. Far into the night the battle raged. Happy Traum was there and his wife, a little group of those people. I shall never forget it. Oh, it was pure happiness, merriment. Bob played, Bob sang. I was the public. The band had just arrived at that period. The band were, being Canadians, they were a little standoffish towards me because Bob presented them formally, which I think rather amused than edified Bob. Woodstock's gone through many phases like that.
How does the band approach you now?
Just one of the, I hope one of the boys. I've married 2 or 3 of them. I'm very fond of some of them.
Well, that brings us into the new era, the young people that you talk so much about. And could you give us just some of your impressions of the new people, young people, whatever, you know, hippies, if you want to use that word. How do you feel about them? What do they mean to you?
Well, there's a personal element. Many of the people were the people that liberated me and made me, at least if it's my second childhood, it's a very happy one. At first, I was a little afraid of them. We had, first of all, a few of the beatniks. The beatniks were the forerunners of the hippies. They were the hippies with no sense of humor. They were rather macabre. And then came the hippies. And the hippies, I got to know them one by one. I told you the story of Frank, which I've told many times, because Frank meant a total liberation of my spirit and put me in a world that's made me very happy.
What was the story of Frank?
One January night, I was locking up the church. The church is very eerie at night in dim lights. I was conscious somebody was in, and I looked and I saw a rather tallish young man with long hair. His hair formed a frame for a very beautiful, rather agonized, but very beautiful face. And this youth said to me, "Who did all this work?" I said, "It doesn't matter who did the work as long as it got done." Then he asked me, "Could I sleep on your grounds tonight?" I said, "No, you'll freeze to death. I have a blanket. 20 blankets wouldn't do any good." I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "My home is in Tarrytown, but I've hitchhiked from San Francisco with Billy." "Where's Billy?" "He's outside. Why don't you bring him in?" Billy is a dog. I've become Billy's still alive. I'm very fond of Billy. So I told this young man, Frank, I asked him his name, his age. I said, "I can give you a room in the prophet's chamber at the back for the night. It'll have an electric blanket, but I'll give you some supper first." And over the cooking of a meal, which I'm not too clever at, I was studying this boy, thinking I'd like to I do sculpture, wood carving. And he had a very beautiful face, I thought. And his quotations interested me because they surprised me that he made quotations from sources I didn't think he would dream of. Make a long story short, Frank stayed with me for several years. Frank is now still here. He brought his friends, relations, acquaintances, and others. They all settled down, living on the grounds here. Of the dropouts of school, they were all back in school, except Frank, who was in business for himself. And it was this group that took me across the tracks into the world of the common man. I'd been a bishop 54 years. I happen to have been the bishop now the longest in term of service in American history. I've been an archbishop 57 years. I was the youngest bishop when I was consecrated. I'm now the oldest. I was fast becoming old and grouchy, opinionated, until these boys took me by the scuff of the neck and took me into their world. They took over the cooking of my house and narrated their stories of their life and why they violated parole, why they did what they did. I couldn't think that they were so wrong. I thought the laws were wrong. They brought their parents here sometimes. I got to know their parents. And they introduced me into a world that is now a very big world, because I find that wherever I go, I find hippie friends. And I'm known pretty generally. I've been in print, I think 11 times, as octogenarian hippie priest. In fact, one of the Christian Science papers wrote me recently that I was something to do with a hippie curate, which has completely demoted me. Because a curate is the assistant to a vicar who's appointed by a bishop, who's appointed by an archbishop. That left me suspended in midair, you see. It was good for me.
Retrogression, so
Yeah, exactly.
What about their culture? What did it teach you as a priest, as an archbishop? What new doors did it open to you?
Mostly have faith in my fellow man. To do away with the divisions that were tormenting us. because they lived together. I'd visited their communes, and I'd seen them together, living as I'd hoped so-called Christians would live. But they hadn't lived that way. There was a love there that really meant something. It was not a sickly, silly sentimentality. It was something where you shared to the last crust.
And what about their morality?
I didn't know they had any of particularly offensive. It was not half as offensive as the hypocrisy of a lot of my church people who prayed to God on Sunday and prayed on the fellow men all week long. I was a little perturbed when I accepted an invitation to visit a commune once. In a commune that had 47 people in it. I went with Darrell, a young man who lives here. When we arrived in a borrowed car, we were met by the reception committee. Nobody had a stitch of clothing on but Darrell and myself. And Darrell looked at me, thought I'd be shocked, and I looked at Darrell knowing full well he'd be shocked. Finally, I said, Father, we'd like you to talk to us. I said, no, I'd like to talk with you. And they gave me the only chair available. I finally sat down on the chair, and there were 47, 48 with Darrell, people sitting cross-legged in front of me. I completely forgot they had nothing on, because of the questions they asked were questions that mattered. I used to go there every Tuesday.
What type of questions?
On religion, giving one the desire and the determination to make life longer, happier, and more useful. Mostly as it affected us here. Not like in many churches where it affects you in the hereafter.
That's very important.
It's all important. All important, I think. We've had the other wilderness of religion, and where has it gotten us? Nowhere. We suspect everybody and exploit everybody. I think they're hippies themselves, if they're allowed to grow. There are false hippies too, you know. It's like recently, the editor of one of the big dailies was up here, and he asked me, he says, Father, you must have met a lot of very good Christian people in Woodstock. I thought for a minute, yes, I think I met 5. 5? Only 5, yes, and 4 of them were Jews. How come? Well, I told him the story, how that when I had a heart attack, the hippie boys were supposed to be looking after me. They'd wandered off in the woods that night, adventuring. When it was reported in the Woodstock village that Father Francis was dying of a heart attack, 5 people called on the telephone, wanting to look after me for the oncoming winter. 4 out of the 5 were Jewish people that I'd never met, but that had heard of me. The other was a woman who had 3 sons. And I told her, I think you have 3 sons. She said, 4 will make it easier. I didn't go, I stayed here. These people are still my friends.
How many times have you retired?
I retired officially once with a great sound of trumpets. But I unretired right afterwards because I found that I didn't know how to retire. It was boorish. I wasn't made for retirement. I've only just begun. Life begins at 80.
Tell us about some of your experiences in Chicago. You said you knew Clarence Darrow.
I knew Clarence Darrow as few people knew him. I used to meet Darrow. I used to either go in the courtroom before Judge Barassa and other judges and wait for him. Sometimes, if I thought Darrow was losing a case, I'd call him over, especially if I knew the religious background of some of the judges, and Darrow and I would have a nice talk, and we'd say in a loud voice, we'll have dinner together tonight, Mr. Darrow, and that usually used to affect a little bit the judge's opinion. I knew Darrow wasn't the militant atheist that they'd like to think he was. I wasn't born yesterday. The district attorney at that time was Maclay Hoyne. I used to keep them with Mac's sister. I used to have dinner every Thursday night with Maclay Hoyne. And Mr. Darrow would tell me some of his cases, and I used to tell Mac Hoyne, go easy on Darrow when he's the defense attorney for so-and-so. Why? Well, just go easy, or you'll hear about it at the next election. Everybody in Chicago thought that Maclay Hoyne was a good Catholic. And I used to say, if you don't go easy for Darrow, because Darrow was my idol when I was coming out of a shell. I used to say, at the next election, I should drop the news that your grandfather was a Baptist minister. Everybody thought he was Maclay Hoyne was a Catholic, you see. Hoyne would say, Is that a threat? No, it's advice. It's godly counsel and advice. I could write a book about Darrow and the nightclubs we used to go to, the little plots for the defense and other things, because he became quite a hero to me. He would do the things in the flesh that so many people annoy God by asking him to do it in a roundabout way.
You also knew Javon?
Yes, well, I met him in New York afterwards. But in the days of Chicago, there was a little bunch of people, what my father called my bunch of lunatics. Frank Lloyd Wright, a man more infallible than the Pope, but he got there. Carl Sandburg, who used to come over once a week with his guitar, when the guitars were very rare, sit cross-legged on a homemade couch I had and sing sapphics. We thought it was quite hopeless. We see he'll either get over it or the wagon will get him. Look at Carl Sandburg since then. Kindly man, not fair to look upon. He had mops of tousled hair, but a big heart.
Javon seems to mean quite a bit to young people today. Could you tell us a little bit about your association with him?
Well, when I first came to New York, when I was appointed Archbishop, it had to be in New York City. I got acquainted with Dr. Guthrie. Dr. Guthrie was the rector of that once very beautiful church of St. Mark's in the Bowery, perhaps the second historic church in America. Dr. Guthrie was the most intellectual man I've ever met. He bewildered me at times and delighted me. And he was having a conflict with his bishop. I, being a bishop, couldn't take sides, but I knew where my affection was. And one time Dr. Guthrie said to me, "Can you speak Turkish?" I said, "Yes, I speak Turkish fairly well." He says, "There's a young man lives in one of my apartments here that can speak Turkish. He's a Lebanese." Well, I said, all educated Lebanese speak Turkish because it's the lingua franca of that country. He said, "I'd like to introduce you. I'd like to meet him." He says, "He's a writer." I said, "They all write in that country. It's not a large population." So he took me to 110 East 10th Street. And there were 2 vacant apartments, and I moved into one, and Khaled Gibran had the other one, and we used to pal out every day. I tried to teach him English, and I used to brush up on my Turkish. And then he brought a manuscript, and it was the Prophet. I tried to read it. Dr. Guthrie said, "Do you think there's any merit in it?" I said, "It's an Eastern mind. It's different to ours. I don't know what he's getting at." But one day Gibran came over. He says, "We're going to recite the Prophet in a sort of dialogue form in St. Mark's." So Gibran and I sat together. It was very lovely, but it was of the Eastern, never the twain shall meet, East and West. I knew him for about 3 years, and he wrote several books. Then he went back to Lebanon and passed away. He was a little man, if not... Well, probably there were giants in those days. I don't know.
What is Javon's significance to the young people today?
There's a sort of a prophetic note in the Prophet. He has minimized the altogether too far out now, don't mistake me by this, the too far out theological aspect of the deity. Young people want a God that they can touch, that they can talk with. That's an older brother, not somebody sitting on the golden throne. The young people, they're realistic. And Gibran's prophet was such. Gibran's race has given the world, even in the Vatican Council, the only outspoken people who spoke really intelligently were Lebanese. It's an amazing group. I think perhaps if the Lebanese were put into the Israeli Arab thing, they probably could settle it. Perhaps. It has to be settled somehow.
In the young people here in Woodstock, when we talk about them, and the exodus to Woodstock, because basically that's what it is. Why do you feel Woodstock is such an attraction to them? What makes them feel that Woodstock is their mecca?
Now that I've wanted to find out. I often wonder why. I've said, why did you come to Woodstock? The mountains are beautiful. Yes, I know, so a garden's beautiful, many places. There's something here. There was a promise of a future recognition of youth here through art that seemed to give them hope. If you ask any of the boys on the village green, they can't exactly tell you why they came, except their friends came. There were only very few at first. I know the first few that started coming to my little church here made pandemonium among some highly respectable people of yesteryear. I was a little standoffish till I found out they were far better Christians than I ever could be. But they didn't wear a label. And the hippies have had a hard time here. I don't know what else to call them. I mean that with great reverence. I remember the first time I heard that word. The magazine Holiday had a write-up on Woodstock. It was not a fair article as I thought, but they had a picture of me in colour. I don't know who took it. It was outside of the church. And they called me Hip, Father Francis. And many clergy wrote letters and said, you should sue the Curtis Publishing Company. I said, before we do anything of the sort, and I never would sue anybody, we must find out what hip meant. And I called up Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan laughed. Father, you know what hip means? He said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. You want a definition? He said, Father, you're slipping if you need a definition. Well, I need it for certain reasons. There's some people here, and I have to answer a fool according to their folly. And within 5 minutes, Bob called back. He says, you want a definition for hip and hippie? It means a total awareness, I think, and that you've been for a long time. And he banged down the receiver, thinking I was slipping, wanting a definition. And I think that's probably what it is. They don't live as we theologians live, with little definitions, with things that are captive in words which are very changeable. A world of semantics. It's a world of reality, a world of hope, a world of brotherhood, a world of tomorrow. And that's what I find in the better ones, and that's what we're hoping and praying for. And I had them coming here for several years, living here, living in my house, taking over. I've never had the slightest shadow of disrespect from any, but I would have had if they'd had to call me Your Grace. I would have fallen from my Christmas tree, I know. But they've been like a lot of young brothers. So I've said, and I say it every day, the last 5 years of my life have been happy, and the whole 82 put together, because I associate with these apostles of the new generation. The people that are going to break down the fences that divide us. And the gospel that was taught by that poor man of Nazareth, that is everybody's brother, nobody can claim him absolutely, will be the gospel of all of us. And that is what the little church on the Mount stands for. I put in a plug here because this is the only church in Christendom that's dedicated to the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is the sermon that Jew and Gentile can accept as it is, because it will make us all brothers to work together.
Changing the subject just slightly, realizing what you say is in my opinion, perfectly true. Why drugs necessarily? Why is
Drugs?
that problem?
I haven't seen as much evidence of drugs as I used to see the evidence of hard liquor. I mix with them freely. I've only seen 2 people that were obviously under the influence of drugs that have come up here. I've seen them in the village, but not markedly so. When I was young, not too young at that, a teenager in Chicago, the whole country was half drunk part of the time and totally drunk the rest of the time. We forget that, and the Salvation Army will back me up in that. And I think we overstate the case of drugs. We had drugs in 1916, but we didn't put any emphasis on it. It's become a topic of conversation. It's infinitesimal compared with the problems of liquor. Still, I believe, and it's still been in the New York Times, stories of that. But it seems to be a topic of conversation. There's something eerie about it. Something. We've always taken drugs of some kind, if it's whether it's aspirin, call it another name, other. I don't feel personally qualified to talk on that subject because I've said about taking an aspirin. But I can see the evils it might do. But I don't think the evil is 1/10 of 1% what the evil used to be of hard liquor. And I think the Salvation Army will back me up in that.
Well, actually, your figures are quite right. Alcoholism claims more lives next to automobile accidents.
Yes. It's never been a problem with me in my work. I've known people that have been high. I've learned much of the hippie language, which I can use to the amusement of the hippies and the consternation of some of my friends. But long before this was manifest, I used to know people that took certain things, but it was not an object of wonderment like it is now. Perhaps we're getting more socially minded. Perhaps the world is really better off than we suspect. I hope I'm right. When I read the newspapers, I'm afraid I'm not. But it's always darkest just before daylight. And if the hidden things are brought to light, it's half the battle won.
Where does Woodstock go now?
Now, a little more patience, a little less repression of the young people, a little less of that bare feet only, which would keep the 12 apostles and the poor men of Nazareth out, a little of magnifying silly little things, a little less of the putting labels on. Woodstock will be synonymous, as it is at the present time, I find, the world over. It's a meaning, a hope of the future. I'd like to see it kept that way, as an oasis in a big desert of conformism, which is very foreign to the American youth. Woodstock has always figured in history. When Queen Elizabeth I, she was about to go to the block at the behest of her sister, she took refuge in Woodstock, which is just outside of Oxford. And you'll find all through the Tudor period, Woodstock looms up as a place of refuge, a place where you can get stabilized. So it's not a new word for me.
Thank you. You have here one of the few Gutenberg St. Aquinas.
Thomas Aquinas. It's a summa, that is the gathering of all of the theological implications of Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the greatest doctors of the Western Church. There are 34 Gutenberg Bibles in whole or part in the world. There are only 9 of the Gutenberg Thomas Aquinas. The Bible was done, the Thomas Aquinas, the Gutenberg was, Thomas Aquinas was done in 1469, the Bible in 1464. But this is much more sought after as a rarity.
What are some of the other treasures you have?
I have a copy of the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. That I'm going to give to Yeshiva. They should have it. Josephus was a Jewish priest, a historian, living in the very, very earliest of days, and I have the first printed copy. I have a copy of the Luther Bible in German, the first edition and the second edition. I have a copy of the history of the bishops of England with the annotated marginal readings of the man who kept the diary for Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Mary, and Edward VI.
And some of the paintings you have?
I have, in the church, there's a painting by Montaigne of St. John on the Isle of Patmos. There's a painting of St. John the Baptist by Guido Reni. And there's a Fra Angelico.
All in this little church?
In this little church. And there's a painting in here, a very handsome painting by Peter Lely of the Royal Stuart. Queen Elizabeth I has most of its collection. I was in Windsor Castle Art Gallery 3 years ago, and I said to the curator, these look like Lely's pictures. Says, do you know anything about Lely? I know he's a Dutchman that took on English citizenship and painted the Stuart monarchs. I says, yeah, the curator says, yes, Her Majesty's bought the whole collection. There are one or two missing. I said, did you ever hear of the Royal Stewart? She says, that's the one the Queen would like. I said, well, I own it. It was given to me by an American multimillionaire, and it's in my house. At least I hope it is. It's an unfinished picture. She says, yes. And he says, don't let Her Majesty know or she'll get it from you. I says, oh, my dead body. That's in my study here now.
Father Francis, tell us about Alfio Faggi.
I met Mr. Faggi really through Mrs. Frank Rattray Lilly, whose husband was a very famous professor at the University of Chicago. Mrs. Lilly commissioned Mr. Faggi to do the Stations of the Cross in St. Thomas the Apostle's Church on 58th Street, which were a sensation because they were all modern. And the people didn't like them because they were modern. They wanted something Murillo style. And when I first came here, I met Mr. Faggi and said, you knew Mrs. Lilly very well. He said she was my helper, but she liked the pictures of the stations I did, but nobody else did. I said, well, I like them, Mr. Faggi. But he was broken-hearted. He was a very lovable, sensitive soul. And the fact that the parishioners wanted to have the stations taken out and the ugliness of the world around him broke Faggi's heart, really. He was not made for this age of ugliness, you see.